Dead Relatives by Lucy McKnight Hardy, published by Dead Ink Books. Lucy McKnight Hardy was first published as the author of the debut novel Water Shall Refuse Them, which I have not read. But now I really want to, because I've read Dead Relatives, and it is fantastic, wonderful gothic fiction. Lucy McKnight Hardy also has a very similar bio to myself. When I read her bio in the back, I was quite surprised. She's lived in cities all around the UK and abroad, and she grew up in West Wales, where I went to university, and she now lives in Herefordshire, where I grew up. So that was kind of interesting. Anyway, Dead Relatives is a short story collection, but the first quarter of the collection is the titular Dead Relatives story, and it is by far the longest story in the collection. It's about 66 pages, and all of the other stories are more like 5 to 15 pages each. First, I'll talk mainly about Dead Relatives, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about my favourite other stories from the collection. But I will say that there is a running theme that I noticed all the way through the book, which is about children. The protagonist of Dead Relatives is a child, and a lot of the other stories are either about children, flashbacks to childhood, have child protagonists, or even child villains. There is a running theme of childhood and mother-child relationships all the way through Dead Relatives. So the first story, Dead Relatives, tells the story of Iris. Iris is a young girl, she's in her early teenage years, and she has always lived in this one house. The story is clearly set somewhere in the early decades of the 20th century, and Iris lives with her mother out in the countryside in this big house, and it is immediately very, very gothic. It has this isolated setting, a naive and a little bit weird protagonist who doesn't know anything except the home that she grew up in and continues to reside in, and there are people that come into the house. The people that come into the house, periodically, are all women, and they're referred to just as the ladies. And I initially imagined very highbrow, high society women in frocks, but they're not. It becomes very, very clear early on that these ladies are actually sex workers who have gone in the family way, as the book repeatedly says. They are all pregnant and they need help. And that's what Iris's mother does. She provides these young women with help. So these young women come to Iris's mum for help. They stay at her house for a few weeks, months, they have the child, and then the child will be adopted. Iris watches all of this, and we see it all through her perspective. So it's never entirely clear what is going on at any given time, because Iris's perspective isn't entirely reliable. She's not an unreliable narrator per se, she's a naive child. And that naive child perspective is used to fantastic effect all the way through the story. The titular Dead Relatives are a collection of pictures on the stairs of their house and around the landing at the top of the stairs. You're not sure if they're paintings or photographs at first, and it doesn't matter. But she talks to these dead relatives. They are all people of her mother's family that she did not know, but there is some creepy relationship that she has with these dead relatives. She seems to be able to see them smiling, see their reactions shift, and she even has their voices in her head. And again, we don't know if any of this is real, if it's actually a haunting, or if it's just her overactive imagination. She's a bored child living in a house, a big empty house, with her mother, a cook, and a groundskeeper for company. And she creates a lot of stories, so it makes sense that she would create these characters out of her dead relatives. But we're not sure. Maybe there is something supernatural going on, and that is the question all the way through the book, in a very, very traditionally gothic sense. Quite often with gothic stories, the creepiness comes from the fact that anything that appears supernatural may or may not be true. That's the beauty of the gothic, is that it is so camp and absurd sometimes, while remaining dreadful. And Lucy McKnight Hardy absolutely captures that feeling of dread and strangeness and campness and isolation all the way through this story, and in many of the others as well. Iris also has a friend, I guess, called Dolly, and again, it's not clear who or what Dolly is. When the ladies come to the house, Iris's mother tells her that Dolly needs to be kept in isolation, and so Dolly remains in Iris's room. Is Dolly a doll? Is Dolly something else? Is Dolly an imaginary friend? Does Dolly physically exist? This really played on my mind all the way through the story, but all that Iris says at the beginning of the story is that Dolly has a messed up face. Her body is fine, but she has a bit of a weird face. So I was like, is this a doll that maybe when she was a kid she kind of played with roughly and now it has a screwed up face? Or is it an imaginary friend that for some reason she imagines as having disfigurements? I had absolutely no idea. But the mother says that Dolly has to be kept in Iris's room. So does that mean that the mother is just placating her imagination? Or is Dolly real? I was so confused. And another weird aspect of the story from the very beginning is this dead tree. This dead tree lives on the grounds of the house, and Iris is obsessed with it. She spends a lot of time visiting the dead tree and feeding it, giving it scraps of food that it can suck from through its roots. It's strange, her relationship to the tree, to the house, to her mum, everything. But it all screams of an overactive imagination of a bored young girl who is slowly going into her teen years and obviously wants more out of life but doesn't even know what else life has to offer. And occasionally these young sex workers are coming into the house and drip feeding her information about music and dancing and life in London. And she's getting a very skewed perspective on life from her clearly withdrawn mother in this very isolated place, and women coming to her from the strangest parts of London, these women with fascinating backgrounds that are so different from Iris's, and they are occasionally providing her with information about life beyond the walls of her house, a life that Iris may or will never see. This is a gothic story through and through. The house itself, the strange aspects, Dolly and the tree, and there are so many just little perspectives and ideas and ways that Iris sees the world that kind of freak you out. In the very opening page, she is watching the cook prepare a meal, but Iris refers to the thing that she's preparing as a corpse. It's clearly a chicken or a turkey, but she just keeps calling it the corpse. And so right from page one, I kept thinking, are they cannibals? Is the corpse a person? Is it a child? What is it? She's calling it the corpse. It's freaking me out. Good. Let it freak you out. Iris has an overactive imagination, so you can't trust anything she says. But you also can. You can just go along with it and see the world through her eyes. I loved my time with this story so much because it encapsulates everything I love about the Gothic. Although it's actually not as camp as a lot of Gothic stories. Like, my favourite novel, Frankenstein, is very camp, and this doesn't quite have that feel. It's more Shirley Jackson. It's more Daphne du Maurier kind of Gothic, and I love that too. I really think this is one of my favourite short stories I've ever read. And after you finish Dead Relatives, there's a whole bunch more much shorter stories to get involved with. Not all of them land brilliantly. Two of the shortest stories in here are great examples of how to write a short story brilliantly and poorly. Writing a very short story that's 4 or 5 pages long is such an art. It is something that I so admire in writers. The ability to write a short story that has believable characters, an interesting plot, a beginning, a middle, and an end, all in a handful of pages is just incredible. The story that I am referring to that really succeeds as a tiny little story is called Cavities, and it tells the story of a woman who has just gone to the dentist and she's had one of her molars removed, and she's tonguing at it and she's giggling to herself about the fact that it's all numb and she can't feel anything. And if you've ever had a tooth removed, then you'll know that the gap in your gums always feels enormously large, like way bigger than it should, way bigger than the space of a tooth. As you're fitting your tongue in that gap, it just feels so big, and she remarks on that, so that's relatable, and that immediately makes you like that character. But then she flashes back to her childhood, and her relationship to teeth, to dentistry, to a boy at school who had really nasty, horrible teeth, and this boy would also bully her. And the bullying then factors into what happens next in the adult protagonist's life as she's walking down the street coming out of the dentist. It's amazing how in a few pages you get an establishment of a character, a kind of weird, overly graphic physical description, followed by a flashback to some traumatic bullying that happened in her childhood, which then feeds into the next thing that happens to the adult. Absolutely brilliant. This was a masterful setup and event after event that occurs in just a handful of pages. I absolutely loved it. I was so impressed by how she handled that story. A lot of these stories have twist endings, And that really works. It always works with a weird short story. And that story, Cavity, is no exception, and the twist ending is really eerie and strange, and I loved it. But I said that there was another example of a story that didn't work quite as well, and that's a story called Parroting, which is 3 or 4 pages long, and it's about a boy who lives in a block of flats, and there's this really, really old woman who also lives in the block of flats, and the boy and his mother know this old woman, and the boy is curious. One day, the boy and his mother help the old woman carry some groceries up into the lift and then into her flat. And when they do that, he sees that the old woman has a parrot in a cage, and he wants to visit. And there's a twist about the parrot and the old woman. And it's only 4 pages, I think, and it just didn't land. I didn't really like the twist ending. It left me feeling nothing at all. So these are 2 examples, Cavities and Parroting, where the short story art form is perfectly executed, and then not so much perfectly executed. But this is often the case with short story collections. Some stories land, some don't. Some will stay with you forever. A lot of short stories remain in my mind much more impactfully than a lot of longer novels do. Others just don't hit you hard at all and just feel like you wasted your time reading them. Most of the stories in Dead Relatives are absolutely worth reading. There's one that I really loved called Resting Bitch Face, which is about a woman and her relationship to her entire family, mostly the men in it. What I liked so much about this story in particular is that all the characters are just referred to as the woman, the man, the child, the in-laws, the husband, the wife, etc. They are not given names at all. And the husband is a perfect archetype of your average British, boomer, misogynistic, Tory asshole guy. He's perfect. At the very beginning of the story, he remarks that she has a resting bitch face, and how he learned about that term through Facebook. And I was like, wow, is this my dad? Is this my granddad? Is this my uncle? Is this pretty much any British boomer man that I know? It just felt so perfect that he insults his wife very passively, very cruelly, without even noticing that he's done it, probably, maybe. And he learned it off Facebook, which is responsible for Brexit, anti-vaxxers, and most conspiracy theories today. And that all happens in like the first paragraph of that story. I thought it was so impactful. I loved it. That story is particularly good. And again, it has a really harrowing twist ending. I didn't think it would. I thought that Resting Bitch Face was going to be a story that perfectly encapsulates ordinary modern marriage with shit British men. But actually, no, it still has a gothic, strange, horrifying twist ending to it, which really left me surprised and left my jaw on the floor. So as you can tell, I really enjoyed Dead Relatives. I enjoyed almost all of the stories in here. The titular Dead Relatives is a particularly impactful story. I really found it to be such a powerful story. A perfect Shirley Jackson, Daphne du Maurier-esque short story. And because it's 60 pages, it really fleshes itself out brilliantly. And so many of the other stories in here do the exact same thing. Again, this child character, child protagonist. There's so much of the child in here, and it's used brilliantly to so many different effects. You get bullying, trauma, parent-child relationships, naive kids who become unreliable narrators. There's so much of that. A lot of the stories use flashbacks to childhood to belabor their point. I could talk about all the stories in here, honestly, so I'm going to cut this off. It has to end at some point. I really, really loved Dead Relatives. Dead Ink Books have published a really special collection of stories here. If you're spending your Halloween reading gothic horror stories, you need to be reading these. If you enjoy reading gothic stories, gothic novels around Halloween, if you love Shirley Jackson and Daphne du Maurier, please check out Dead Relatives. It really is a fantastic book, and it's published by one of the UK's best indie publishers. So Dead Ink deserve your support, Lucy McKnight Hardy deserves your attention, and Dead Relatives deserves to be read. And I deserve some subscribers and some patrons. So join my Patreon if you can afford to, and subscribe for books.